In the last talk, we were discussing planning in a larger sense, but in particular focusing on environmental planning. And in this talk, we're going to look at a few examples of what happens when you do environmental planning well, and what happens when you don't do environmental planning well, and the consequences of environmental planning economically, socially, politically, because they're significant. The first of the examples we're going to look at today is actually my hometown. So this is near and dear to me. And I'm sorry to say it's a bad example. I don't show a lot of bad examples in the class. I mean, who wants to see crappy architecture, right? But you know, sometimes you kind of have to see what the consequences are when design is not done particularly well. And I'm sad to say that this area where I spent my childhood, and which I've continued to be very interested in through my adult life, is a kind of sad case of where environmental planning was not practiced well and things were not done well, and it's been a disaster. So this area is, my town that I grew up in was Friendswood. At the time I lived there, the population was 900. Within a couple of decades, it was 25,000. So it was a big boom that happened there. But when I was a kid, it was, you know, honestly kind of a little hick town, and not really seen as suburban Houston as it is now. It was far enough out of Houston. It was just a little small town on its own. There were three characteristics of the area geographically. One was that it was incredibly flat. Of course, the whole coast of Texas is extremely flat land. Another thing is that it had clay soils. And clay is interesting. It's absorptive up to a point, and then it just kind of seals off. So it does absorb some water. It's not like sand where the water goes through it. But at a certain point, it kind of seals off. And then it also is an area that's very subject to extremely heavy rain. And I mean, they get a lot of rain, period, about 50, 60 inches a year, which is double what Austin gets. But also the rain often comes in buckets. I mean, it just deluges in a very short period of time, tons and tons of rain. So it's a very unusual climatic situation in that way. When I was a kid, this was handled pretty well. Actually, the agriculture in the area was rice farming. Rice farming was perfect because you needed to flood your fields. So the clay soil would, as I said, absorb and then at a certain point seal off. It was flat ground, so you could flood the fields with just a few inches of water without doing much earth movement. And the farmers would do their rice farming, and then they'd make it fallow for a couple of years. They'd run cattle in there, and the cattle would drop their manure on it, fertilize the land, re-enrich the soil. Their cloven hoofs would aerate the soil to some extent, and then they'd go back and farm rice on it again. So that was a cycle that worked very well with the agriculture and the geology and geography and climate of that particular region. So that worked extremely well for a period of time. Then in about 1962, NASA moved in, and that changed everything. A bunch of Yankees moved in from the point of view of a hick that's living in this small town. Now suddenly all these Yankees move in. Their dads are engineers. They're extremely well educated. They're smart kids. They were really showing up us hicks. And it was a complete transformation of the area. And they came in and they loved the areas that were around the creeks. There were, in the area, lots of beautiful creeks. And the creeks had big trees by them. And so the initial subdivisions they did were taking advantage of the natural beauty of those trees along the creeks. And in our little town, the first of those big fancy subdivisions was called Imperial Estates. I never did figure out what empire that was a part of. It was kind of a pretentious notion here in our little hick town. We have Imperial Estates. But it was very high-end subdivision, and it had very important people from NASA who were moving in there. So Deke Slayton, one of the original 7 astronauts, lived in Imperial Estates. Christopher Kraft, who was the voice of NASA, he was the guy you always saw on TV. He lived in Imperial Estates. So it was maybe, I don't know, 60 to 100 houses along Clear Creek, right at a bend in the creek. And that was the kind of subdivisions they were developing. And they loved those big trees with the Spanish moss and sold like hotcakes. Now, traditionally, people had not built by the creeks. They built on higher ground away from the creek. Because the creeks were always, it's flat land, you know, they're heavy rains, it's subject to flooding. But, you know, that's what people wanted, you know, they could sell the land, it seemed fine. In a kind of short-sighted way, that's where they inhabited the new subdivisions, was along the creeks. There actually were 3 things that were big problems as this area began to develop very rapidly. One thing is there was a lot of impervious cover that was put down. So that's impervious, impervious cover. And what that means is you seal off the land so the water can't be absorbed there. So when you put a slab on grade for a building, that's impervious cover. When you put a roadway down, that's impervious cover. When you put a big parking lot for the grocery store or the Walmart, that's impervious cover. So as people began to move in and there was development, there was way, way, way more impervious cover. So that impervious cover meant that soil that could have absorbed the water was no longer available for absorption. And so that water had to be disposed of some other way. And in many areas, up to 60% of the land was covered with impervious cover. So obviously, you got a lot more water disposal problem at that point because there's no absorption. So one problem was impervious cover. A second problem was they put in storm sewers. And in some ways, there's nothing wrong with storm sewers, but there were some bad things about storm sewers in that application. Prior to that, they did not have a sewer system. There's sewer and there's sanitary sewer. Sanitary sewer is when you flush your toilet, that's where that goes. But there is just the sewer system, which is really taking, you know, in Austin, where you see at the corner there is a gutter, and the water goes in the gutter and mysteriously disappears. But in fact, what it does is it goes to a storm sewer pipe, which is a big concrete pipe, sometimes 5, 6 feet in diameter, even more, and it takes that storm water off. So previously, our little hick town did not have curbs and gutters and storm sewers, but that looked a little country and not very sophisticated. So when they're building these new subdivisions, they put in curbs and gutters and storm sewers. And one issue with the storm sewers is it's finite sizes. Prior to that, you know, out in the front of your house, you'd have a ditch. And that ditch was grossly oversized because all you did was just take a maintainer blade and cut it a little deeper there, and that gave you a lot more capacity. So the water would collect in the ditch would run into a ravine, the ravine would run into the bayou would run into the creek would run into Clear Lake, and then into the ocean. So all that was kind of surface water. But once you put it underground in a finite-sized storm sewer pipe, then if things change, you can have a real problem because it's sized to a particular amount of water that's going to come. And what was coming when there was far less impervious cover was obviously going to be very different than 20 years later when you had all that impervious cover and you have a lot more water to dispose of, and you have a finite system based on 20 years before. So The storm sewer really had the problem of finite sizing, but it also had the problem that in the sort of ditch, ravine, bayou scenario, along the line some more water would be absorbed. But once you put it in that storm sewer, nothing's absorbed. Everything has to go the whole length of the storm sewer system. So again, you just have more water to dispose of. So it was a problem created by impervious cover, a problem created by the finite dimensions of the storm sewer system. And then the third problem was subsidence, and that's S-U-B-S-I-D-E-N-C-E. So subsidence basically means the ground is falling. So it's the opposite of Chicken Little where the sky was falling. This is the ground is falling. And what happens is that we don't think of this, it even seems a little counterintuitive, but the ground is actually held up by the water table. And there is a fluid down there that is holding the ground up. And if you start depleting that water table, then there's nothing to support the ground and it begins to fall. And that's subsidence. The whole Gulf Coast, especially around Houston, has had incredible subsidence. Some areas have fallen 18, 20 feet. In this Friendswood area, over a period of about 20 years, there was 10 feet of subsidence. Now, they're already not that much above sea level, and a 10-foot drop was significant. When you think about that, that's like 10 feet over 20 years. That's like 6 inches a year. That's a ½ an inch a month. You can almost sit on your porch and watch the ground falling out there. I mean, it's a lot of subsidence. So areas that previously were a high enough elevation to be out of the floodplain, now they're dropping and they become in the floodplain. So the combination of too much impervious cover, finite designs of storm sewer systems, and subsidence meant that an area that did not have flooding when I was a little kid, areas that no one had ever remembered that being flooded, now suddenly they're completely flooded. And in 1979, there were 2 big rains, wasn't even a hurricane, but 2 big rains, and in both of those rains, there was flooding like crazy in Friendswood. My parents' house had about 30 inches of water in the first rain. That house had been there for decades and had never had any water. There'd never been any flooding anywhere near that house. It was not built near the creeks. It was built on higher ground. But because of subsidence and impervious cover and inadequate storm sewers, it got flooded 30 inches. They barely got it fixed back up again. There was another storm and it got flooded again. Fixed it up again in 1983. Hurricane Alicia came through, flooded again. And this was kind of the pattern. In 2009 or so is Hurricane Ike. And then again, 2017, Hurricane Harvey. Horrible, horrible devastation by flooding in all of those events. So here is a community that had been there for a long period of time. Here's land that had been perfectly habitable and good to live on. And now, because of the way we'd managed these environmental planning issues, there's terrible, terrible flooding. That whole subdivision of Imperial Estates, the first Imperial Estates, they actually tore out all the houses, 60 to 100 houses, really nice houses, beautiful houses. They just took them out because they just kept flooding over and over and over again. And now it's just vacant land again. And I can't emphasize enough the devastation that's created with flooding. I mean, I'm sure that plenty of you, if you've lived in Texas or you lived on the Gulf Coast, you've probably known someone or you've experienced the flooding yourself. Everything is ruined. Your rugs and carpets, obviously, then all the sheetrock, it wakes up the sheetrock, you have to take all the sheetrock out of the house, all your possessions, valued things. In our house, my parents had an organ, it was all ruined. My grandfather's library was all ruined. It's a horrible thing. And then because people didn't have insurance, because this was not flood-prone area, but because we changed the ecology of the area it became a flood-prone area, and people were caught off guard. They didn't have flood insurance, and they were screwed economically. A huge part of your assets are tied up in your house, and now your house is not only not livable, and you've got to figure out a way to fix it, but also real estate values are in the tank. Nobody's going to buy that place if it's flood prone. So this is horrible devastation that was created by this inadequate kind of unaware environmental planning issues. So I am happy to say that there's a modestly good ending to that story. Over a 35-year period, I watched that town just get flooded over and over and over again. And I watched, my parents moved from the house that flooded, luckily, and moved to a place that did not flood. But other people, other neighbors, other friends, just suffering over and over again. But then just recently, there's been one new subdivision that did it right and just showed that you can inhabit that area, you can make wonderful places for people to live, you can make a lot of money as a developer, and yet follow those environmental principles, and the results are very different. So that good example is a subdivision called West Ranch that's on the west side of Friendswood, and in it, they followed a few fundamental environmental principles, and in Hurricane Harvey in 2017, no one got flooded in West Ranch. The rest of Friendswood was devastated. My sister sent me pictures of a deer swimming in the water across the main drag in Friendswood. There was at least 6 feet of water over the main street. All of the grocery stores, all of the kind of commercial area just devastated. Thousands of homes flooded. But in West Ranch, no one got flooding. And the reason is they had created these big detention ponds. And the detention ponds are there so when a big rain comes, everything drains to here, and it's a big holding pond where instead of the water being in your house there, instead it's able to accumulate in that holding pond. And then after the rain is over, because like I said, it comes in buckets and then it's gone, and then you can slowly release the water downstream without the devastation of the flooding. In addition, it makes these beautiful ponds that people can have their homes around. This woman was out there fishing. A little later, I saw her catch her fish there, so it's kind of cool. They've got recreation areas around those ponds. Occasionally they get flooded, not a problem to clear off the recreation area. But people's homes are all perfectly safe, and all of that is helping them avoid that kind of flooding. My sister moved from her house where she was always worried about flooding every minute, every time the rain started, to this subdivision where she can be rest assured that her property values are protected and that this is a good place that will not be flooding because they applied good environmental principles. Second example I want us to look at is on the other side of Houston. And this is one where from very early on, at the very beginning of this project, they followed environmental principles. This one is the initial phase of the Woodlands, which is north of Houston. There was a couple that had made a lot of money in oil. It was George and Cynthia Mitchell. And they decided they were going to use some of that money to invest in a new town north of Houston. So they bought tons of land up there. It was not in any municipality, so they didn't have to follow anybody's rules. They brought in Ian McHarg, who was this very famous environmental planner. He'd written a book called Design with Nature. That gives you a sense of where his head is. And they brought him in to help plan the Woodlands. And there were 4 major principles that he followed from the beginning in the Woodlands. So they're coming out to this virgin land out there. The first thing he said is, don't build on the lower land. Now it's basically flat, but still, even in flat land, some parts are a little lower, some parts are a little higher. So we're not going to build on any of the lower land. All of that is left unbuilt. And then in those lower lands, we're going to build detention ponds. And this is way, way before that one I was showing you in West Ranch. This was the mother of thinking about detention ponds. And so they dug out areas that would be able to hold the water. All the drainage would go to that lower area, and then there would be detention ponds that would be through there. So the first two really good ideas are don't build on the lower topography, and then put in detention ponds in those areas. And then those became recreation areas, so all of this in the woodlands was not built on, and it became hike and bike trails, it became swimming pools, which who cares if it floods in a swimming pool, it became art parks, it became recreation space, and actually increased the value of all that land around it because it had scenic views into this open space. Here you can see one of those detention ponds. This is a classic example where you look at it and you think, oh, it's just a nice scenic pond, how sweet. No, this is not about scenic. This is about physical considerations. All of that capacity there is for rainwater that can come and fill it up and fill it up and fill it up, and it's a huge pond. So enormous quantities of rain can be stored there and therefore not go into people's houses. And then slowly they re-release that downstream. They put a little waterfall across there. They stocked it with fish. This little guy's catching him a fish. They got ducks, go quack, 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 quack. I mean, everybody's happy here. And they think of it as just an amenity. But in fact, it's a response to flooding and to the difficulties created when this heavy rainfall comes in this area. So the first two things are don't build on the lower land and instead put detention ponds there. Two other things they did. They really watched impervious cover. So this is hardscape. It's an area in a sort of shopping area. And that could, of course, have been concrete or stone pavers or something like that. But instead, they made it wood, a wood decking, and they left little gaps between the wood so the water can go through and the soil can still absorb the water down there. And they have created hardscape without creating impervious cover. Simple solution, smart thing to do. They also made their streets much narrower than in most subdivisions because they weren't in a municipality, they didn't follow somebody else's rules. In Texas, most municipalities say you have to make the street at least 32 feet wide. Now your car is about 7 feet wide. Two cars can pass each other pretty comfortably in 18 to 20 feet, but super comfortably in 22 to 24 feet. But in Texas, most municipalities require even the smallest street with a tiny amount of traffic in a cul-de-sac in a residential area, they require 32-foot wide streets. And that's an enormous amount of impervious cover. In the woodlands, they said, we're making our streets 24 feet wide instead of 32 feet wide, with a great reduction of impervious cover. And you'll notice that there are no curbs and gutters here. So at the edges of the street, they did not collect the water on the streets. They did not have a storm sewer system. Instead, in the backs of the houses, there are what they call ground swales. You know, for me, that's still kind of a ditch. I mean, that's what I grew up with, that's a ditch. But these are shallower than a ditch. But it is a way to naturally dispose of that water on the surface instead of putting it subsurface in a finitely designed storm sewer system. So the third and fourth thing they did here is they avoided impervious cover, and they did not use a storm sewer system. Instead, they used ground swales in the backs of the houses. So those four principles were applied in the first phase of the woodlands. It was very, very successful. Now, I have to say, not a big fan of the architecture of that first phase of the woodlands. You know, homely, but environmentally, man, fantastic. And about the same time, they developed Kingwood on the other side of the freeway, and they continually had problems with flooding in Kingwood. But in this first phase of the woodlands, they were not having those flooding problems. Now, there has been a lot of subsequent development around that first phase of the woodlands, and that has affected, of course, the water migration through there, and it isn't quite as good as it was at a certain point. But that was very good environmental planning at the beginning. Unfortunately, maybe not carried through completely in the subsequent development of the woodlands. The third example, so maybe Southeast Houston, terrible environmental planning, but it turned into something better at the end. The woodlands, fantastic environmental planning, but maybe they lost their commitment and vision a little bit. This third example of Sea Ranch in California is an example of extremely good environmental planning from day one and a sustained commitment to that over a long period of time, and just a really, really well-performing environment in what was a beautiful landscape. So this is on the coast of California. Again, we looked a couple of talks ago at the condominiums in Sea Ranch. Now we're kind of looking at the whole 5,000 acres and what did they do there. So that whole terrain had been covered in redwood forest originally. About 130 years ago, they had cleared the whole area and used the redwood for timber. They'd allowed the redwoods to grow back in the area away from the coast, but along the coast they'd left it cleared and used it for cattle grazing. Now I mentioned that it was extremely windy here, and when they would graze cattle out there, the wind was so strong sometimes it knocked the cow on its ass, so they decided they had to do something to protect against that. So they planted these hedgerows that you can see right there that were perpendicular to the coast, and that gave shelter in particularly windy times for the cows. So that was the landscape that they came to. And the planner here was Lawrence Halpern, a very close colleague with Ian McHarg, very much the same kind of attitudes as environmental planners. Beautiful, beautiful terrain along there. Here you can see those hedgerows like that. 1, 2, 3, 4 hedgerows. And that's what they looked like. There were double rows of Monterey pines with a little space in between for the cows to shelter in there. So what they did was they looked at those hedgerows. This is the highway that's going along there. On this side of the highway, it's mostly open. On this side of the highway, it's mostly forest. And then there are these hedgerows that go like that. So as they began to plan the development of that area, they took those hedgerows very seriously, and they would make the development in the shadow of the hedgerows and nestled up against the hedgerows. And then they would leave the space in between those meadows as open as they possibly could. And then they clustered the homes in a way, just like we saw at the condominiums, where they're clustered together. And then you have big open spaces in between that are maintaining views up and down for those clusters, but also are leaving the vegetation and the topography and everything unspoiled. So 2 really great ideas. One is to cluster the development and leave large areas unspoiled. The other one is then to take advantage of those hedgerows and really build, when you build up against the hedgerows. So here's the condominiums we looked at Sea Ranch, which are nestled into that hedgerow, as you can see right there. And really, there's the hedgerow, they're nestled up there. And so really, it makes them less visible, less obtrusive on the landscape. It also uses the hedgerow to give them protection from the wind. And you can see that clustering. That clustering's happening here too. These are a development done by the architect Joseph Eschrich, and the buildings are nestled up against the hedgerow. And you can even see how the wind has blown the trees there. And you can see that he just took that same angle and made the roof angles so that the wind would be diverted by the roof angle, and then there would be a leeward side of the building where you could be outside and protected. as we can see right there. And you can see how then the meadows are here. The houses are clustered up against the hedgerow. And the beautiful scenery that was there is virtually unspoiled. Occasionally there are houses out in the open space, like the old barn sat out there. Mostly they're nestled into existing vegetation. These are two different houses by Don Linden, one of those original architects of the Sea Ranch. The thing that's remarkable here is how they've managed to keep the ecology. One of the things that's super important here are these grasses. It's very sandy soil. They're very high winds. If you disrupt the grasses, if you take away that root system of the grasses and the soil is left vulnerable, then it just blows away the topsoil immediately. And that causes terrible degradation. So you have to keep as much of that grassland as you possibly can. And as you can see, pretty much the whole area is this grassland left like it was, and the buildings just built up against the hedgerows. This is a house by Charles Moore, one of those other partners in doing the condominiums, built up against the hedgerow. You can barely see in here, there are subterranean kinds of houses that are like dug into the earth, and then with a view on the downhill side to the ocean. But again, extremely sensitive to the ecology and really working with the landscape there. And then of course the classic condominiums at Sea Ranch, beautifully, beautifully designed. And then there also are these sort of special elements, things like pools that are bermed into the ground and protected from the wind and nestled up against the trees there so that they're as inconspicuous as possible. Tennis courts done the same way. Throughout the whole development, there is this sensitivity to the land, the landscape, to environmental issues, to the wind, to the soils, to the rainfall. And in the end, they managed to inhabit the space very thoroughly. They made a ton of money. The developers did extremely well. They've got thousands of people who are living out there, but in a way that's very ecologically and environmentally sound. Now you take the contrast of, let's say, some of the hill country outside Austin, where they've just done business as usual subdivisions, plop, 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 roads, roads, roads everywhere, lots of impervious cover, lots of cul-de-sac streets. Then you'll have the shopping mall with huge parking lots, and the hill country's gone. What was beautiful landscape and kind of attracted people to the area, now you screwed it up. It's not beautiful anymore. And there are ways, obviously, to keep that kind of landscape quality and not screw it up and work in a much more environmentally sensitive way. So the bottom line here is how fundamentally important and what an asset it is if we're thinking of environmental issues and environmental planning. When we're looking at issues of geography and topography and ecology in our development of places to live and places to inhabit in the landscape in general. Okay, see you next time.